Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on whenever it is that you are watching or listening to this report. As you know, I am Ron LaFace with Capital City Consulting, and I have with me today Megan Fay, my colleague at Capital City Consulting. And this is the 2020 end of session report or wrap up. Today is Thursday, April 16th. We are recording this wrap up to be provided to you virtually, and as I'm sure Mr. Turney and Ms. Vicencio has already informed you, we also plan to participate virtually in the April 29th school board meeting, where we will be available to answer any questions or provide any further context to the items from the 2020 session, as well as provide updates on any issues that have occurred between the recording of this report and that board meeting. Mr. Burke may have already provided you with some general overview of the 2020 proposed state budget that is going to the governor for his approval. But from a high level, the budget appropriates $93.2 billion, which is a $2.24 billion increase over the current 1920 budget. Of that, $35.2 billion is state general revenue, and $22.7 billion is for K through 12. An important item is this budget does have approximately $3.9 billion in reserves. You might see from the budget summary bullet point and some of the items that you've read in the paper, the legislature put $1.3 billion in unallocated general revenue or cash into reserves. But one of the issues that's not being reported very, very clearly is that you combine that $1.3 billion with another $2.5 billion that's in trust funds as cash in the budget stabilization fund, and the total is $3.9 billion going into this COVID pandemic. The number is actually a little higher than that because the January and February state revenue collections came in about $100 million over estimates, but that money would just be added to the budget stabilization fund. Now, jumping into a high-level education budget summary, as you are aware, we assisted in securing $200,000 for the African American History Museum and Library at historic Roosevelt High. That funding, combined with the $150,000 that we secured last year, would round out this project for a total funding of $350,000, which was the initial request. And that project is pending review by Governor DeSantis, and we've been working with his office on providing him with information to help secure his approval. The budget also appropriates $500 million for teacher salary increases. $400 million of it is for starting teacher salaries to get them as close to $47.5 as possible, and $100 million is for other teachers' salary increases. The budget has a $40 per student BSA increase. And an important addition to this year's budget is, even though the legislature did not change the way that the district cost differential is formulated or the methodology used to calculate it, the legislature did provide a new categorical that provided funding to districts who, even under the same DCD methodology, the amount that they received from the DCD, if it decreased between the current year budget and next year's budget, then the legislature provided funding to hold harmless that decrease. For Palm Beach School District, that provided us with $9.4 million to help keep our DCD funding level at the same level that it was, or that it is in the current budget. There is a new cost in the budget to school districts. The legislature decided that they needed to increase the employer share for employees in the FRS. They did it for all FRS participants, whether it's the state or voluntary participants like local governments, colleges, universities, and school districts. System-wide for school districts, this new cost will be approximately $230 million, and we'll certainly have our share of that cost based on our employee count. The legislature did increase funding for workforce by $12 million. And then also in reference to the RLE, or required local effort, as in years past, the legislature only counted new construction in the RLE and not increased property values. So as before, there is a rollback in the RLE millage rate from 3.888 to 3.733, and that will continue to be an item that we'll ask the legislature to take full advantage of the RLE, particularly as we're entering into this economic downturn. And then one last item is the legislature did increase mental health funding by $25 million. So for a total funding of $100 million for mental health.
Thanks, Ron. This is a good segue into legislation, as House Bill 641 is the bill that implements the teacher salary increase and specifies how districts are required to spend the $500 million. The bill also repeals Best and Brightest and gives the Department of Education flexibility to implement the upcoming instructional materials adoption that's tied to the new BEST standards, which, as a reminder, was Governor DeSantis's priority that he did through an executive order, which is kind of the final repeal of all Common Core in Florida. Before we move on from House Bill 641, I wanted to note an amendment that was filed to the bill by Senator Montford. As some of you may recall, Jay Boggess from Palm Beach County Schools testified on behalf of the district at the Career Source meeting in February in Tallahassee about the impact of the change to the CAPE industry certification list, which would have had a negative impact both to Palm Beach County school grades and a financial impact of about $4.5 million with the proposed changes to the list. Senator Montford's amendment would have kept the 1920 CAPE list in place for an additional year, allowing the district to have that full year of transition, which is one of the things that Mr. Boggess asked the Career Source Board to consider when he testified. The amendment was ultimately withdrawn from the bill, but the Department of Education has agreed, because of kind of the dynamics of the amendment and how the traction it was getting in the Senate. They've agreed to keep both the 1920 and 2021 CAPE lists in place, giving us that one-year transition that we had asked for at the Career Source Board meeting. Moving on. Senate Bill 810 by Senator Simmons is a priority bill of Attorney General Ashley Moody. It cracks down on tobacco use and vaping and raises the legal age to purchase tobacco from 18 years to 21 years of age. The bill also limits smoking and vaping on and around school property by minors and cracks down on some of the flavors that appeal to minors that were being marketed by the tobacco companies.
Oh, thanks, Megan. So switching back to House Bill 7097, which was the annual tax cut bill. This bill did pass the legislature and was approved by the governor on April 8th. This bill originally cut about $230 million in state taxes, but as we started to recognize the economic downturn that would be caused by COVID-19, they did scale back the tax reduction bill to cut about $50 million out of next year's available revenues. So that bill was tempered, understanding that the pandemic was going to affect Florida's revenue collections. With that said, there are two provisions in there that we would like to point out. One of them is that it requires that school capital outlay sales tax surtax that districts are able to levy for capital projects must be shared proportionally with charter schools. This is very similar to what the legislature did last year as it relates to our voted referendum. Now, there is an important distinction. As you know, Palm Beach County has a sales surtax, but that sales surtax is one that is shared with the county and is not affected by this language. This language only applies to the school capital outlay sales surtax, which is 0.5% that can be levied just by the district. So this does not impact our current sales surtax referendum. With that said, I do think it's important to note this because in the future, if the district does consider, once our sales tax referendum expires, using this 0.5% sales surtax option to continue funding capital projects, that sales surtax will need to be shared with charter schools in the future. The bill also includes the annual back to school tax holiday. It will be a 3-day tax holiday this year, and it's set for August 9th or 7th through 9th. The next bill that I'd like to bring up is Senate Bill 434, which is designation of school grades by Senator Montford. This bill modifies the high school acceleration component of school grades to add students who complete career certificate dual enrollment courses that have at least 300 or more clock hours. There are about 290 career certificate dual enrollment courses that meet that 300 hour requirement. And what will happen is the state board will go through that list of dual enrollment courses and select which ones will be eligible to be used to increase school grades for certificate completion. So this is a bill that we should certainly monitor and likely implement the courses that are selected by the state board as a way to increase school grades based on completion of the courses. The next bill is House Bill 81, Healthcare for Children by Representative Andrade. I do think that this is a very important bill that we should focus on. As you're aware, the school district provides school-based health services to many students and those that are on Medicaid. In the past, we've been able to use our expenditure of district dollars on these school-based services for students on Medicaid if they had an IEP or an IFSP and received a federal drawdown, which adds about 64% onto what we spend that are federal funds that are sent back to the school district. But this bill actually opens up the ability to seek that federal match on every dollar that we spend for school-based services for any student who is on or is Medicaid eligible. So the requirements that only certain students you could receive the federal funding for has been expanded substantially. The next bill is Senate Bill 70, which is Panic Alarms in Public Schools by Senator Book. This will be a statewide system that school districts can opt into and implement in their school district if they so choose. The bill is named Alyssa's Alert, and the state will issue a competitive solicitation, choose a vendor that will provide an interoperable mobile panic alert system for school districts. It will be funded at the state level, so there should be no cost to the school district if the school district decides to implement the state selected program. The next bill is kind of our annual school empowerment scholarship bill. As you know, we've had bills the last few years that have increased eligibility for vouchers or empowerment scholarships. This session is no different. The way that this bill expands eligibility is current eligibility threshold, I think, is about 260% of the federal poverty level. This bill expands it to 300% of the federal poverty level and also increases the cap by 1% each year. And you'll see from the bullet points the numbers that are impacted. I do think it's important to point out that there was a provision added that we believe adds additional accountability to the Empowerment Scholarship Program. Students who do receive empowerment scholarships at private schools will be required to take the state assessment or an additional or a separate norm reference assessment, so that there will be accountability on the instruction that they're being provided by the private school. And also would like to point out that the bill does also provide an add-on FTE bonus funding for certain dual enrollment courses, or if a student receives an associate degree with a certain GPA, there is additional funding that would be added on to that student's FTE. Now, I do think that we need to look at that provision in light of our MOU with the state college, but it is a available increase of funds that I want to make sure that the district is aware of. Now moving into bills that did not pass, but are very important because we spent an exorbitant amount of time on those bills. The first one is House Bill 7079, related to education by Representative Alupis. This bill was a Department of Education proposed bill, and probably the most controversial component of the bill was that it would put schools into turnaround if they received a single D. That's as opposed to a double D, which is currently the situation. And so that did cause a lot of concern by school districts, because there are reasons that a school might hit a single D that's not related to instruction. Maybe there were boundary changes or some other issue that occurred. And with school district involvement, they're able to move the school out of a single D without changing the personnel at the school, which a turnaround designation would require. The second issue that caused some concern in the bill is the bill changed the definition of evidence-based for purchasing materials using the reading categorical. This new definition of evidence-based was much more stringent than the current definition, and the concern is that that definition change would be a hidden cost to districts, because if our programs that we currently have that we were funding through the reading categorical did not meet the new definition of evidence-based, we would have to change those programs and purchase new ones. But like I said, this bill did not pass, but since it was a department proposal, we expect we may see some of these provisions in the future. The other bill to bring up is Senate Bill 1220. You'll see the title is K through 12 scholarship programs. That is because this bill became the Senate version of the Empowerment Scholarship Program, which I've already discussed. But originally, this bill was a professional development bill. This bill was a bill that was drafted by Senator Manny Diaz, the Senate Education Chairman. It really revamped the way that professional development is viewed in K through 12. A couple of the provisions that there were some concern with is one of the provisions required school districts to allocate a dollar amount to each teacher's professional development, and then grant the teacher the ability to use 25% of that for professional development that they believe that the teacher decided that they wanted to pursue. There was just some concern that that may impact district-wide professional development programs. There was also a statewide registry that was developed, where in order to provide professional development, you had to meet certain criteria and be registered with the state. But there was also a new pilot program in the bill, which the administration showed interest in, called the peer pilot program, which would have allowed extended time for professional development, more teacher collaboration, and leadership opportunities. Originally, this pilot was just being offered to Clay, Pinellas, and Walton counties, but with the administration showing interest, we had asked Chairman Diaz to add Palm Beach School District to the pilot, which he did. And so ultimately, we hope that that pilot is proposed again next year, since it is something that we viewed as a positive. There would be additional professional development funding associated with it, and it's something that we think would be beneficial to the teachers in Palm Beach County. And then the last bill that I want to mention is the term limits on school board members. As you know, this idea has been around for a couple of years. There was a lot of discussion and hype about this bill, I would say, this year, from particularly the House of Representatives. They felt that there was interest on the Senate side to put a school board term limit referendum on the 2020 ballot. So they talked about it and moved that bill through the House of Representatives. Now, when the Senate began to look at it, I think that the interest on the Senate side was vastly overestimated, and the Senate at the end of the day showed no interest in the bill, and it did not move in the Senate, and so it did not pass the legislature.
Thanks, Ron. Moving on to House Bill 1013, Early Learning by Representative Grawl. This bill also did not pass, but it proposed a number of changes to early learning in Florida. The bill made changes to the accountability system for VPK providers, including the addition of learning gains and in-person classroom observation to the VPK provider score, which is something that the VPK and early learning coalitions have been lobbying the department to do for several years now. The bill also directed the commissioner to develop an assessment that would measure early literacy and math to measure student progress from VPK through grade 3. The bill was a priority of the Department of Education, and so it's likely that we'll see it filed again next session. And the last bill I want to touch on is school safety. The House and Senate bills had some differences to them, but a number of changes were made in both versions to the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas Safety Act. The bill made some positive changes, like specifying that school safety officers, for example, at Palm Beach, who has their own district-run school safety officer program, would have jurisdiction on charter school campuses to make that much more clear. The bill also cracked down on fraudulent tips that were submitted through the Fortify Florida app. But ultimately, the bills did not pass because the House bill had some troubling provisions, including new and expanded language allowing the State Board of Education to withhold superintendent salaries because of noncompliance. And so it's not likely that it is likely that we'll see a similar bill filed next year as school safety continues to be a priority for the legislature.
Thank you, Megan. And I will point out that the school safety bill not passing this year was somewhat of a surprise to everyone. We had spent a lot of time working through the provisions that Megan mentioned, and at the end of the day, felt that the legislature was intending to pass a version of the bill that we thought would be beneficial to school safety, but ultimately, in the last, I guess I'd call it the last day and last few hours of the legislative session, when bills are flying back and forth, this one, just for whatever reason, did not make it across the finish line. But with that, I would like to thank you for following along today. As I mentioned at the beginning, this will be a two-part process, and we do look forward to participating in the April 29th board meeting. In the meantime, we are closely following both the Florida economic issues as well as the federal CARES Act money that is being proposed. Will say that Florida definitely does not know what the ultimate impact is going to be for COVID-19. We are experiencing it in some parts of the March revenues, certainly the April and May revenues, and we won't know those revenues for a few months. There was some news out of Moody's stress test where they look at state governments and what impact COVID-19 might be having on them. That stress test was not great news for the state of Florida. Moody's estimated that COVID-19 could be an $8 to $10 billion impact on Florida. That impact is a combination of lost state revenues as well as increased cost on the Medicaid program. But what it also, what needs to be taken into account is not only what I mentioned at the front end of the approximately $4 billion the state has in reserves, but with the federal CARES funding, there is additional and I think it's $4.5 billion that's being provided to the states or the state of Florida for budget stabilization. So we're approaching that $8 to $10 billion estimate by Moody's with about $8.5 billion in state reserves. But time is going to be the one that tells how that turns out. I'm sure that you're also being provided with information that we are providing and Ms. Solnit is providing on the Federal CARES Act funding. There are 3 pots of money that are a part of the CARES Act as it relates to education. The first one is certainly the governor's emergency fund for Florida. That's about $173 million that can be provided to any educational entity, whether it's public, private, higher ed, K through 12. And there is a lot of discretion on how the governor spends that. So we are working with the superintendent and the administration on providing feedback to the state in ways that we think that money could be spent to help students. And then the second pot of funding that is important to us is there's about $770 million that's earmarked for K through 12 in the state of Florida. 90% of that funding will flow straight through to the districts and is not supposed to have any strings attached to it, other than some very specific items that we can spend it on, which are basically everything related to COVID-19. Of the 10% that's held back, the state can do statewide contracting or response for K through 12 and keep, I think it's about a 0.5% for administration. So those programs, the applications at the federal level are just becoming available. We're following them closely. I'm certain we'll have further information to provide you at April 29th. But what I do want to point out is important as a part of these federal funds is there is a maintenance of effort requirement on the state, meaning that as a trade-off to taking these federal funds, the state is required to continue higher ed and K through 12 funding at the same level that has been provided for the last 3 years. And there is a waiver to that maintenance of effort, but the state would have to demonstrate, why it can no longer maintain funding at the same level that it's had in the past. So we do view that as a potential positive as we're, looking at decreased state revenues and potential future special sessions to address Florida's budget. So with that, again, thank you for following along with Megan and I, and we look forward to talking to you soon. And as always, any questions or need for additional information that comes up in the meantime, please, reach out to us or let Mr. Attorney or Ms. Villavicencio know, and they will get that to us, and we will provide you with the response as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.